Hello all, welcome to this webinar and thank you for joining. My name is Bas Hoksberg and I'll be your host today. My colleague Ryan Sainsbury will be presenting this webinar. We expect this to take about 35 minutes. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A or the chat buttons at the bottom of your screen to get in touch. We might answer these questions on the fly or at the end of this webinar. I see a nice list of attendees. I hope we can make this interesting for all of you. So without further ado, let's get started.
Thank you very much, Baz. I'm just going to share my screen. Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Sainsbury. I'm a technical project specialist for Pharos Architectural Controls. Welcome to today's webinar. So today's webinar is going to be a TPC project walkthrough. I'm going to walk you through a typical project that you would use and set up with a TPC, and we'll also be looking at the following items. So as I said, basic project file setup, importing interface themes, creating stuff like a basic homepage using the theme editor, and also the type of programming that you're going to want to use with your triggers. So in order to walk you through this project file, I've decided to put together a bit of a project specification. So this is, again, a typical project specification that you might find that your client comes to you with that would be an ideal solution for the TPC. So we've got 4 parts to it. The first part is that the customer wants a system that allows them to have zonal lighting control. So the idea is that we're going to have 4 independent zones and that the user can then select presets for each zone acting completely independently of each other. We're also going to make a UI that's branded for their corporate company, so with their logos, with their color palette. We're also going to then create a page that's a super user page, if you will, so a page that's protected by a PIN code that only people with the correct privileges can access. And then finally, we want all of that information to be fed back to the TPC so that they can clearly see what state the controller is in. So I'm just going to go ahead now and I'm going to look at some of the basic things that you'll need to do to set up your project file. What we'll do is we'll start off by opening up Designer. And the first thing that you're probably going to want to do is then obviously start a new project. So you can click on New Project in the top left-hand corner. And then you have the option to either customize a project to obviously give you a certain framework, or you can use the Quick Start menu. Because we know we're going to use TPC, we can use the Quick Start menu. Give it a couple of seconds, and then the layout view will populate like this. So this layout view is where we're going to create a 2D plan of our fixture layout. So this is going to allow us to organize and also visualize the fixture layout in our project file. So the first thing that I always like to do when I get into the layout view is I like to pull in a background image. This can be a JPEG or a PNG, and you can do this by going to Manage, and then if you go down, there'll be a area where you can pull in a background image, click on the blue folder, and then just pull in a background image that you think is suitable. Schematics work well, but also you can use just an image of the floor plan or even just of the building if you're working on something like a media facade. I'm going to go ahead and bring that in, and then I'm just going to adjust the width and the height so that it matches the background image. And I'm also just going to adjust 1 or 2 other properties here that might help you out as well. So one thing that I do want to quickly just note is when you pull in fixtures onto your layout, you have a grid that's on the background. You can adjust this grid spacing just to get a finer resolution of movement. So I'm going to quickly turn this down as well. And then obviously I'll be able to move my fixtures a little bit more intricately. So once you're happy with that, you can simply click off this page and we can go to the next part. So there we go. We've got our layout looking great. Now we're going to pull in some fixtures. So we have a fixture library over in the right-hand corner. It comes with various fixture manufacturers that you can use. But also, if you wanted to, you can also download fixtures from our online service, which I'll show you in a little bit. Fixture profiles effectively just allow us to tell the controller how we want to control that fixture. So if you imagine you obviously have lots of different fixtures out there, lots of different parameters, using the correct fixture profile will, of course, allow you to control them correctly. So as I said, if you can't find the fixture profile that you're looking for, you can download it from our online service. Just click on the cloud icon with the arrow in the top right-hand corner. Quickly search for the fixtures that you want to use, in this case, Pharos Architectural Controls for today, and then just hit download. And that'll download the fixture profiles down to your Designer program. So now I'm going to just do a quick search for the fixtures we're going to work with today. and you can see in the bottom section of the fixture library, we have all these demo fixtures. The first section that I'm going to work with is going to be my downlights, which is in my top left-hand corner. So I'm going to go ahead and select my downlight RGB fixture. I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to drag that into the top left-hand corner. So once I've placed that there, I can then use a couple of quick shortcuts in order to speed up my workflow instead of dragging and dropping them over and over again. When a fixture is selected, it will go red. You can then duplicate that fixture using either Control and Command and then holding down on your mouse and then simply letting go when you want to drop that fixture into place. So again, Control for Windows, Command for OS X. You can then obviously drag and drop those into place. Once you've done that, you can lasso them by just clicking and dragging over all fixtures. That'll then select them all. And again, you can then just repeat that just to make extra lines or even extra fixture shapes. One other thing that we can do that's really useful within the layout view as well is we can create shapes. So I'm going to start working on my chandelier area down here. And I'm going to right click. I'm going to go to duplicate. And now once I hit the duplicate option, I have the ability to create either a rectangle or a circle. In this case, I want to create a circle. We have a couple of parameters that we need to fill out, such as the count, which is the amount of fixtures we want to repeat, and then the radius, which is the radius of the circle. Go ahead, click finish. That'll obviously then make those that fixture shape for you. And then finally, if you just want to neaten it up, you can use the transform tools at the top. Make sure the fixtures are selected, hit the transform tools, and then you can see that you can now adjust and modify the shape of that set of fixtures. So once you've completed your layout, it should look something a little bit like this. And it's at this point that we need to start thinking about the different zones within our project file. So I've gone ahead and I've already made a couple of groups, which is going to help us, again, target our set of fixtures in that zone. So I've got my downlights area, which is the top left. I've got my chandelier area, which is the bottom left. I have my stair area in the middle, and then I also am going to quickly show you how to create a group now for the fixtures on the right hand side. Simply select all of them. Once they're selected, right click, new group, and then you can just give that a name, and you can also give it a number. And again, as I said, we can use these groups to build programming with, and we can also target them with special actions within Designer. For now, though, I'm just going to set that group up. One other thing that I want to highlight as well is I've created something called a pixel matrix. This essentially allows us to map fixtures so that we can apply dynamic effects or even media to them. So that's the first thing that you're really going to need to do for zonal control. Create different groups, because we'll obviously be referring to those groups later on in our programming. So just make sure you have those groups in your project file. And if you need to and you want to create a pixel matrix for more dynamic effects, you should probably do that as well. Let's move on to the patch window. So the first thing that I want to look at is just how the TPC works. The TPC by itself is an EDMX only controller, meaning that it will be able to support ArtNet, Streaming ACN, KaiNet, and PathPort. They're all EDMX protocols, but you can purchase an EXT, which is an accessory device for the TPC. That will then give you some extra ports and some extra inputs and outputs for stuff like integration. But today, I'm just going to use it for the DMX port, and I'm just going to make sure that that's selected. As I said, you will need an EXT to do this. If you don't, it's an EDMX only controller. But once you've got your EXT set up with your controller and you've brought in DMX Universe, patching fixtures is relatively easy. All you have to then do is obviously drag and drop your fixtures onto the patch window. One quick tip: if you get your fixtures in the correct order, i.e. the order that they're addressed in, assuming that they're addressed correctly, you can then just create a group for that fixtures, and then of course you can just patch those fixtures, assuming that they run one after another in terms of their addressing. So once you're patched, upload to the controller. It's probably a good idea just to check your fixtures are patched correctly. There's a little light bulb icon that you can see at the top of the screen. Once you've done an upload, that'll go blue. You can select your fixture either in the layout or in the patch window, and then you can hit that and that will highlight it. And you can then obviously just check that your patching and your layout's correct. So now I'm going to come on to actually building some lighting effects for our project file today. So I'm going to use the timeline view to do this. In the timeline view, you can see that over in the left-hand corner, we have all of our groups, the downlights, chandelier, stairs, etc. We also have access to our pixel matrix, so we can apply pixel matrix effects to it. We have some play controls. Oh, sorry, I think I've lost the video there. Let me just start that again. Apologies for this. There we go. Got that back. So yeah, as I said, we also have some controls to allow you to obviously play and stop the timeline should you need to. Over to the right, you also have the ability to output live as well, so you can see your timelines on your fixtures in real time. And of course, you can zoom in, zoom out your timeline just so you can have a little bit of a better detail. So we're going to be looking at the preset library first. So over in the right-hand corner, we have access to two different types of effects. We can have access to pixel matrix effects, or we can even have group effects. Now, it's really important that group effects are used, obviously, with groups, and pixel matrix effects are used with pixel matrices. You won't be able to use pixel matrices effects on groups as well. But I'm going to just start off by using a very simple group effect. I'm just going to use the white preset, which is essentially an intensity preset. I'm going to drag and drop that onto our downlights. And you can now see, once I've done that, in the bottom right-hand corner, you have all of the effect properties appear. So you have the intensity that you can set it to. You also have the ability to adjust the fade and release time, the amount of time that it takes to fade in and release out. And then finally, the effect length, because obviously timelines run in a linear time-based fashion. So one other thing that you can do as well is you can select the hold end option. This is really useful if you want your effect just to hold indefinitely, which obviously means as soon as the user starts it, it will start, but then it will just hold in its last position until it's told to release or end, which again can be done by the user via the interface a little bit later on. So I'm going to set that to hold at end so it holds indefinitely. And then what I'm also going to do, just to finish up here, is I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually going to just name this timeline. I'm going to call this downlights 100%. One other thing that I quickly want to introduce you to as well is the manage window. Again, you can rename stuff and renumber your timelines here. Again, I'll be coming onto this a little bit later, but it's quite important just to kind of show you this feature now. And what I want to quickly do just to finish off is I want to quickly go ahead, create a new timeline, and this is going to be for a pixel matrix effect. So I'm going to call this building effect 1. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the preset manager after I've renumbered it. And then I'm going to select my pixel matrix effects. And now what I'm going to do is just apply a very simple dynamic effect to a pixel matrix. Let's use the paling noise. Again, you won't be able to use pixel matrix effects on group effects, only for pixel matrices, but I'm going to get this to hold at end. And then finally, I'm just going to add in another color. So let's add in a bit of black here. One thing that you will notice with dynamic effects, you can also control the rate of them, which can be particularly useful. So if I wanted to obviously speed up the effect or slow the effect down, I can use this loop function down here. If I set it to a period of 1, that means the effect is going to regenerate over 1 second or 0.5 seconds. But of course, you can change this to slow down the effect as well. You can go down to like something like 5 seconds, which is then obviously going to slow it down quite a lot. Finally, just one quick thing. When you are building effects, it's always useful to simulate them. So if you want to have a look at what your effect looks like, if you want to have a preview, just go to the simulate window and then obviously select your timeline, just hit play and away you go. So once I've got all my timelines set up, it'll look something a little bit like this. So what I've done for this project file in order to have some zonal control is I've set up independent timelines for each zone. So if I go up to the manage window, I can show you that we have timelines for the downlights area, chandelier area, stair area, and building effect area. One other thing that's really important to note as well is that I've put all of the timelines for each area into specific ranges. So the downlights are in a 100 range, the chandelier are in a 200 range, the stairs are in a 300 range, and the building effect is in a 400 range. This is going to be really useful for a couple of things later, which I'll show you. We can easily link these to buttons, and not only that, it's a very good way of keeping them organized. One other thing as well, we have a group feature, so you can assign timelines to a group. So for instance, the downlights are assigned to group A. Again, this is really useful if you want to tell all timelines in that specific area to stop. You would use what's called a release all command, and you would say release all timelines in group C, in group D. Again, I'll show you this later on in our triggers view, because that's when it comes into play. But for now, just be aware that this is probably the time that you should set this up when you're building your timelines. Finally, I've got one extra timeline here. This is like an emergency timeline that's going to be triggered for some inputs on the EXT. And I've set this to a high priority. It's just a white timeline that's running over all fixtures. But the reason I've set it to a high priority is just so that it can't be overridden by any of the other effects, which is something that you may want to think about doing. Okay, so now that all of our timelines are set up, we're going to go ahead and we're going to start to build our interface for our TPC. So one thing that you might want to start off doing first is downloading a couple of themes for the TPC. We've got a couple available on our website. You can go to Downloads, Resources, TPC Interface Themes. And then once you go to that webpage, you'll then have access to download a couple of free templates which you can use and modify as you see fit. They're free to download. Just go to the website. You can click on them. Obviously, wait for them to download. You'll need to unzip them. But as soon as they've downloaded to your computer, they're very easy to pull into Designer. The first thing that we'll need to do is obviously go to the interface window, and we'll also need to set up a interface. So we can go up to the top left-hand corner here, or the top center corner, top center, and we can click on the new button. That will allow us to create a new interface. So I'm going to start off by calling this webinar interface example. Just one of two other things as well. You do have the option to set the orientation. We can have the TPC both landscape and portrait. And finally, you also have the ability to pull in a font file as well. This font file can be particularly useful if, of course, you're working in a non-Latin based text, something like Mandarin or Arabic, because then we'll be able to display it on the screen properly. So assuming that everything's okay, I can then go ahead and I can just click next just to take me to the next window. Once there, I'll then be able to either select one of the inbuilt themes that come with Designer, or I'll be able to now pull in the theme that I've downloaded from our website. If you want to pull in a theme, just click on the blue folder icon, navigate to the file that you've downloaded, and you'll be looking for the .tpt file. Click on that. Once you've got that file open, you can then go back to the interface theme and you can select it. Click next. We'll move on to the next page. Now, the next thing that we're going to need to do is going to set up our first page name and an icon for it. So I'm going to call this my home page. I'm also then going to select the home icon. This is going to appear in what's called a page switcher later, so we can navigate to that page. But you can obviously pick whatever icon you want or even pull in your own. I'm going to stick with that though. I'm going to click next. And now at this point, I can use one of the background images from our theme, or if I want to then obviously start, building a TPC interface that's got my client's branding, I could either use, a color or a gradient, or if I wanted to, I could even pull in an image file with their logo on it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. I'm going to pull in a background image that's got their logo and glyph on it. One thing that you should notice one thing you should note about background images, the dimensions need to be 480 by 272 for the best quality, because this is the resolution of the TPC screen. So try your best to obviously get that resolution with their background image. But once you're obviously happy with the way it looks, you can then just pull that in to Designer, and then you can then just click next to move on to the next page. Now, you can select from a couple of different templates within the interface editor. So you can, pick buttons or sliders or color pickers, keypads. For now, though, because I just want to create a basic homepage, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to select the blank layout. Once I'm done with that, I can then click next, and then I can add some navigation in. Now, you've got a couple of different options here. You can navigate with buttons that are on the screen, or you can pick something called a page switcher. I always like to use a page switcher because I feel it's nice, neat, and tidy, and you'll have little logos and icons at the bottom, which essentially will allow you just to navigate between pages. So it's very simple to do. Obviously, you can put the the navigation bar wherever you want. I'm going to go with the bottom for now. Go ahead, click finish, and there we go. Our basic interface has been set up for us, and now we can start to create different elements and control features on the interface. So I'm going to leave the home page for a little bit now. I'm going to come back to that later. But what I want to do now is I want to add in a new page with some buttons. And these buttons are obviously going to then link to our preset. So the idea being that we're going to have 4 pages for each, one for each area with the presets for that area. So you can add in a new page by going to the top left-hand corner. Again, just clicking on new. This will allow you to bring up the wizard again. And then, of course, once you've got the wizard up, you can then start to kind of move through and you can start to create the new page. So I'm going to call this downlights for my first area. Again, I'm just going to select an icon that I feel represents the functionality on that page. So I'm going to go with that, the preset button. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull in a slightly different file now because I don't want the company logo. I want something a little bit more basic. So I'm just going to pull in one with just a glyph. I'm going to click open. I'm happy with that. That looks really good. And then I'm just going to quickly get through the next part. One of the things that I'm going to do now is I'm going to use the page layout with the 9 buttons on it just to speed things up. Saves me having to create and draw on the elements. You can, of course, if you want to draw on individual elements, but sometimes it's quicker to do this. And then I'm going to make sure that this page is added to the existing page switcher so that it's visible and we can navigate to it. So go ahead and click finish. And there we go. We've got a load of buttons set up for us, nice and easy. So the first thing that we need to look at in terms of these buttons is going to be a caption. A caption is essentially just a label for the button, something that the user sees. So I'm going to call this downlights 100% for my first timeline that I've created for that area. And the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to have a look at the key. Now, this is quite important. Effectively, what we're going to do is we're going to format this key in a very special way that's going to allow us to link this button to a timeline. So the first thing that you'll notice is that as standard, the key is made up of 2 parts. There's the button set part of it, and then there's a number. Let's refer to the first couple of characters as an identifier, and the second set of characters, the number, as a timeline number. First thing that we're going to do is we're going to change the button's number to a timeline number. So we look at our timelines up in the top left-hand corner. We can see that our downlights is number 101. So we're going to use that on the end of that button key. So now if I go back to the interface editor, and let's just quickly copy that. What I'm going to do now is just format that button key. I'm going to start off with an identifier for this area. So I'm going to call this DWN. This is going to help in our triggering later on. And then I'm going to just insert the timeline number there. So I'm going to basically rinse and repeat for the next 3 buttons. But it's really important that obviously your button keys will match your timeline numbers. So again, let's just start off with a caption. So we're going to call this downlights 75%. And then again, we're just going to format the button key so that has this identifier and then obviously the timeline number. The identifier in our trigger is basically going to allow the trigger to match that button. And then the timeline number is going to be stripped from the button key. We're going to actually turn that into a variable and then link that to a timeline. But don't worry if you're not quite sure what that means right now. We're going to come on to that in a little while. So once you've done this for each page, you can then end up with something a little bit like this. So I've got my, my 4 different areas: downlights, chandelier, stairs, and my buildings. And of course, each button then has this identifier, and then it has obviously the timeline number that's going to start and be linked with. So you can then obviously just follow this through your project file, but it's really, really important that you kind of get that formatting correct. So here we go. I've got my chandelier section. As you can see, they're all independent of each other, which is great. Okay, some other things as well. The page switcher down here, you have the ability to show the time and date, which I think is particularly useful. And also I've now shown the page names as well. So I've done a little bit of tidying up here, which hopefully is going to make it a little bit more clear to the user in terms of how they navigate around the interface. So the next thing we're going to want to just do whilst we're here is we're going to want to set up a special page that will be able to have like an override control on it, where the user might be able to, select a color for maybe the outside of the building for a special event. But the users requested that this specific page is protected by a PIN code. So in order for us to do that, and for order for us to give our interface different user privileges, the first thing that we're probably going to need to do is set up a keypad. And this keypad is obviously going to then allow the user to put in a code, which is then going to allow them to access this overrides page. So I'm going to go ahead, set up a keypad. I can use the same image as before. That's fine. Again, I'm going to go through the page switcher. I'm going to select the keypad and button combination. One thing that you don't necessarily have to do is add this to the page switcher. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a button on the home page that's going to allow you to navigate to this keypad, just because I want to keep my page switcher a little bit cleaner. And I think this gives the interface a slightly better flow. One thing that we probably will need to do, though, just to start off with, is set up that button. So we will create a new button on the home page. I'm just going to freehand draw one now. So you can go to the top icon and then draw a button. I'm going to give this a quick caption like I did before. So I'm going to call this overrides. One really helpful feature is that you can actually program it in the navigation to the button from the interface. So down here at the bottom, we have a function. I'm going to go ahead and then just select go to page. And then this is going to navigate to our keypad. So the user can click on this button. It will go to a keypad. When the keypad has had a code successfully entered into it, that's then going to go navigate to this overrides page. So one other thing that you might want to do as well whilst you're here is just basically sort out this back button, just in case the user accidentally clicks on it and wants to come back out. So again, give this a caption, use the go to page feature, and again, you can actually navigate them back out of this window. So now we can set up our all-important overrides page. Again, I'm going to click on new, and we're going to add in a new page, call it overrides, use the sliders icon. I'm going to, again, just quickly go through the wizard, use the previous file that we've selected before. This time I'm going to use 3 sliders and a color picker, which is going to allow them to adjust the building outline. Now, it's really important at this point that we don't have this page on the page switcher, because obviously they would just be able to bypass the security. So at this point, we just want to make sure that it's set to none. That will stop it from being accessible. And what we'll do with our programming later on, once the key code has been entered incorrectly, we'll have a trigger and an action that will allow the user to navigate to this page. One other thing that I want to just really quickly do whilst I'm here is I just want to add in 2 extra buttons. Again, I'm going to add in another back button, which is going to allow the user to navigate out of this. And also I'm going to add in a reset button, just in case they want to reset their overrides. You can select elements within the interface editor, and then once you unlock them, you can then change the size of them, a bit like the transform tools in the layout view. And that can then obviously, just help you create some more space on your interface. So I'm going to call this back. Again, I'm going to use the inbuilt navigation buttons. And then I'm also going to create my reset button, which is going to reset my RGB look on the building. So just give this a special key, reset, and I'll link that in my triggers later on. Okay, so last sort of things for the interface editor. We have a theme editor, which allows you to change the look of certain parameters within the interface. So for instance, if I wanted to change, let's say, a button, I can go to the interface editor. In the left-hand corner, we have all of the different control elements, buttons, sliders, color pickers, etc. And then over in the right-hand corner, we have all of the states that button can be in. So of course, you can change the states to show that the button is active. So for instance, I'm going to select this blue look. That's going to be my active look from when a timeline is running. I'm going to just change that to the RGB values that the company has given me as part of their corporate palette. So you've got a high degree of customization here. You can even have things like gradients, as I'm showing you on screen. And of course, if you don't like that look, you can go ahead and adjust it. And you can pretty much do this for any control element on the screen. So yeah, buttons, sliders. And then if you want to have a preview of what that looks, up in the top right hand corner, just select the button, and then you can go to the startup state, and then you can just preview what that'll look like. In your triggers later on, you can change that startup state as well to reflect the status. But for now, I'm just going to set everything to default because that's going to be its default value. I just want to quickly go back to the theme editor. Just be aware that you can also bring in background images here as well if you want to change them over within your interface. And you can also bring in your own icons as well. Again, just giving you a high degree of customization for your interface. Okay, so just a couple of final things to finish off with whilst we're in the interface editor. If you don't want to give your user the ability to have, a kind of a super user page, and you just want to lock the interface as a whole with, say, something like a timeout, you can do so by going to manage, and then you can enter in an unlock code of whatever you want to call it. So 1, 2, 3, 4 for today. And then you can finally set the all-important lock timeout. So I'm going to set this to 60 seconds. So right now with this set, I would actually have 2 keypads on the interface, which is not a bad thing. You'd have a default keypad just to allow you to log into the interface. And then again, you'd have that higher access level where you'd have the second keypad, which will take you to the overrides. But just 2 different ways to set it up. And also it gives you different functionality as well. Final thing, assign your interface to a touchscreen controller in your project file, and then just give it an upload. Obviously, there's no programming to tell the controller what it's doing at the moment, but you should be able to see if your interface looks correct, and you should also be able to at least check if the navigation works correctly. So I'm now going to come on to the next part of the webinar, which I think is one of the most important parts, which is the triggering and the programming that you need to give your interface so that everything works. So this is going to give us the behavior of the system. This is going to allow us to recall scenes, give user feedback. It's going to allow our keypad that has the overrides page to be accessible. To do that, we're going to just go ahead and we're going to start off with the trigger view as seen on screen right now. In the bottom left-hand corner, I've got a screenshot of the interface just to give you some context. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to link our buttons to our presets and give them feedback. Now, you can have a trigger set up so that whenever a button is pressed, the trigger fires, and the trigger type that you would use to do this would be a touch button event trigger. So once you've got that set up, over in the right-hand corner, you'll have your key. Now, obviously, you can select a key, a specific key within the interface, so such as DWN101 for preset 1, and then you can program all your triggers that way. That's very, very time-consuming, so I'm going to show you a quick shortcut now that can potentially save you a lot of time. So I'm going to start off by entering in the identifier, and that's going to be specifically telling the trigger to match a button that starts with that string. So once I've then typed in DWN, the trigger will only match buttons that are starting with that prefix. Once that's done, I can now capture the button number using the following syntax: open chevron, 3D, close chevron. And that syntax is referred to as a wildcard. So basically what I'm doing is I'm capturing the number from the button. I'm then going to create something called a variable, and that variable is then going to help me pick a timeline. And this is why it's really important to have your button keys formatted in that way so that they match the timeline number. So I'm happy with that for now. That started to look really good. Now let's go ahead and let's add some actions to our programming. So one of the first things that I'm going to do is I'm going to release all playback within that area. So we can assume that there's only going to be one lighting scene ever running in an individual area. Okay, so it's just one scene after another. One of the things that's always a good idea is to release all previous playback before you start a new lighting scene if there's only ever going to be one scene running in that area. And that's just good because it keeps the processing power and the headroom of the controller down to a minimum. And I'm going to use the release all action to do that. One of the things that I set up earlier was those all important groups. And now I can use those groups just to say to the controller, okay, I only want to release timelines in that area specifically first. So I'm going to click on the only group A, and that's only going to release timelines in that group. I've got a 2-second fade time. I'm quite happy with that. I think that's good. And the next thing that I'm going to want to do is I'm going to then want to immediately start the new timeline. It's really important that you get it in that order, because obviously you don't want to start a timeline and then suddenly release it. You need to release your timelines first and then start the timeline. So as I said earlier on, I've created a variable using that wildcard capture. So instead of picking a specific timeline, I can say to the action, okay, I want to use that variable to pick a timeline. So now if I set that action to variable 1, that's now going to use the number that we've captured from the wildcard, and that's going to then allow us to pick that timeline number. So we've got our timeline programmed. The next thing that I'm going to want to come on to is the user feedback, and I can do this all from one trigger, which is great. So again, like I did earlier on where I was just releasing all timelines, the first thing that I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to make sure that all previous buttons on the interface were set back to a default state, okay? The way that we can do this is using a set touch control state action. That's going to then change all the buttons from whatever state they were in before, so like in their blue active state, back to their default state. Now you can select every single button using, again, another quick shortcut. I'm going to start off with that identifier, which tells the action we want to specifically look at that room, look at those buttons within that room that start with that identifier. But then you can select all of them just using the star character. So that's now going to select any button that allows, any button that has those first 3 characters and any numbers after that. You can set this to a specific state, but setting it back to the default is what I want. So I'm just going to keep the default option ticked there. That's absolutely fine. But it is important that you just have that star just to obviously make sure that you select any fixtures, any buttons that have the number after them. So now I want to change the actual button that's been pressed to reflect the timeline state. I can go ahead, add in another set control state action. And what I'm going to do is, again, start off with my identifier. And I'm going to use that variable that we've created again, just to basically select the button that's already been pressed. So again, I'm going to use the open chevron, 3D, close chevron. And basically, just so we're aware, that 3D literally means I want to capture 3 digits. The 2 chevrons literally just say to the action or trigger that we want to use a wildcard capture. But you can actually extend this by using a larger number. So for instance, if you wanted to capture 4 digits, you would use 4D. If you wanted to capture just a single digit, you would just use D. There are also other types of string captures as well that you can use to capture different things like hexadecimal codes. Again, you can go to our help and have a look through, go to the triggers, and then just go to wildcards, and you'll see all of the different captures that we can do. For now, though, I want to set that to my blue state, which I've created. And that's just going to then reflect the active state of what the timeline's doing. Once I've done that, I can then pretty much go ahead and duplicate that trigger for each area. Obviously, the one thing that I will need to change is the identifier for the button keys. So for my chandeliers, I've started with the identifier CHN. I'll also need to adjust the group that I want to release the timelines in, and then obviously just adjust all the other parameters as well. But it's pretty simple. I see a lot of people do this programming, and sometimes they use a trigger for each timeline. Obviously, doing it this way, I can really quicken up my workflow. So now I've gone ahead and I've just done that for all different 4 areas, and of course I've got that completed. That's now done, and I can now move on to the overrides page, and obviously giving it access and making that all work as well. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create another new trigger, and this is going to be specifically for our keypad code. So when they enter in the correct keypad code, it's then going to navigate to this overrides page. So I'm going to select the keypad key. I'm then going to put in the code. So I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8, or whatever I want to enter. Once that's done, I can then go ahead and start adding actions to this keypad. So the first action that I'm probably going to add is going to be to change the page on the TPC screen. Don't want to set it to a variable. This time I know exactly where I want it to go, so I can go on the number feature, click search, and I know I want it to go straight to the overrides page. You can, of course, add different transitions as well there. So we've got the snap transition, but it's just important that you just get the code set up correctly and, of course, the page that they are going to navigate to. So now that that's done, I'm going to now move on again, and I'm going to add a new trigger. And this time, this trigger is going to be for the actual color picker itself, so that it can take control of the outer perimeter of the building, and then obviously set some specific RGB values on it. So I'm going to set up my TPC touch color change trigger, select my key, and then I'm going to go to an action, which is going to be set the RGB levels. And finally, I'm just going to pick the group that I want to set the look on. So that's going to be my building outline. And then I'm just going to quickly make sure that the following parameters are set up correctly. So you can see the intensity, red, green, and blue are ticked because they're the parameters that we want to control. The intensity is going to be set to max. You can be set to whatever you want it to be. You can also adjust this with a slider if you really wanted to. But for now, just setting it to max is fine. You will, however, notice that the red, green, and blue parameters are set to variable 1, 2, and 3. If you imagine that a color picker obviously produces 3 different variables, a red value, a green value, and a blue value, we're just simply telling the action that we want to access those variables. And of course, we want to use those to set the color of the building. So really important that you get them in order. Red comes first, then green, then blue, which is why it's 1, 2, 3. But assuming that's all set up correctly and you're happy with that, you can then go ahead and just finish off by maybe setting a little bit of a fade time just to make it a little bit smoother. Something like 0.5 seconds, half a second's absolutely fine, but you can give it a go and you can adjust it to whatever liking you want. So one other thing that I want to do as well, when the color pickers move, I obviously want to update the sliders on my screen so that they reflect the state that the color picker is in. And again, I can do this really simply just by selecting a couple more actions. So if I want to change the value of something like a slider, I can use the set touch control value action. I can go ahead and I can select that. And then once I've selected that, I can then pick the slider that I want to adjust. So in this case, it's going to be my first slider, which is slider 001. And then I have the ability to set that to a variable again. So whenever the red parameter is moved or moved through within the color picker, that's then going to send that variable to that action, which is then going to adjust the color picker's position, the slider's position. So I can pretty much rinse and repeat this for all of the sliders, just obviously making sure that I change the slider key each time, and also making sure that I just then change the variable number to the correct setting. Obviously, the green slider will need to be set to variable number 2, and the blue slider will need to set to variable 3. So yeah, I've gone ahead and done that now. That's looking pretty good, and I can then start to obviously move on with the rest of the programming within the trigger view. So I'm now going to set up the next part. So I'm just going to quickly close that down. I'm going to now add in a new trigger, and this trigger is going to be to reset the override. So I'm going to again use the button press, the reset button that I've got on screen. I gave this a specific key so I could identify it really easily. So I called this reset. And now I'm just going to add a clear RGB action. That clear RGB action is going to clear all of the overrides. So again, I just want to pick the correct fixtures or group of fixtures. So that's my building outline. And I also might want to give this a little bit of a fade time as well, just so that it doesn't snap. One other thing that I might want to do whilst I'm here as well is just add in some extra actions to reset the slider's position. If I'm clearing the overrides, obviously I want that to be fed back to the TPC interface. So again, I'm just going to use the set touch control value action. I'm going to pick my slider, but this time, instead of setting it to a variable, I'm going to just set it to a hard value of 0%, because we know that we want that slider obviously just to drop down. Again, just like before, rinse and repeat. You can obviously change the slider's key to access new slider. And again, just make sure it's set to the value of 0, just to show that that override has been cleared. So one other thing that I'm going to quickly go through now is making sure that the sliders can obviously adjust the color as well. This is pretty simple. Just going to pick the slider from a touch slider trigger. And again, I'm going to go to my set RGB action, pick my fixtures like I did before. One thing that's really important here though, you may want to obviously set the intensity to full, but you're probably going to want to deselect the green and blue parameters and again give it a fade. If I now duplicate that action for my second slider, I can obviously change the key at the top. So this is my second slider, but I will need to obviously untick the red parameter, and I will then need to tick the green parameter for the second slider. And then finally, I'm going to need to change that to variable 1. Now remember, a slider only produces one variable, so that's why it's always set to slider 1. And obviously you just need to make sure that they're set correctly. I see a lot of people unfortunately making this mistake, but just select the parameter you want, set it to variable 1, slider only produces one variable, so you're good to go. Okay, so that's my overrides page pretty much set up. One last thing that I just really quickly want to show you how to do, just set up a digital input trigger if you've got an EXT. It's very simple. Set up your digital input trigger, pick the number of input that you want to look at. There's 8 inputs on the EXT, so I'm going to set this to number 1. And then finally, you have your event, which is either low or high, which is the resistance of the circuit, either closed or open. So once I've done that, I can then go ahead and I can start my emergency timeline. So if I go straight to the top here, pick start timeline, I can then go ahead and pick that from my drop-down list. And again, I can really easily duplicate this trigger. Before I do that, finally, one thing I might want to do, and this is completely optional, you may want to lock the touchscreen. You also maybe want to disable the touchscreen in the event of like an emergency. You can do so by using that action within the action window. So I'm also going to just disable the devices. As I said earlier, you can duplicate this trigger really easily. And then what we can do is we can just change the parameters around. So this is if you were going to reset the alarm. And so instead of starting the timeline now, we're going to release the timeline. Because of the way that our priority system works, that will release any other playback that was going on before will obviously be protected. And then I can enable the touchscreen again. So there you go. That's all my triggers set up. The last thing I'm probably going to want to do is just color code them just to give the project file a nice organized feel in case someone else has to look at it. And one other thing that you can also do to help organize your project file as well as color coding, is you can write in notes for the triggers. So for instance, if I wanted to make people aware that this was some kind of emergency trigger, I would put in something like fire alarm. And then again, you can label it and just make it really, really clear for your users what's going on. So the last thing I want to show you is just how you can go about setting up and configuring the EXT. I get a lot of questions about this, especially for people who are new to our system. Just before I come on to that though, one or two final things. Within the network view, once you go to the properties tab, you can adjust some of the parameters for the TPC screen, such as brightness, how it's an active brightness, how long it is before the screen turns off, so it's in activity. And you can also then adjust further triggers so that it wakes on when it sees ambient light or wakes on proximity even. If you want to configure the EXT there, as I said, you need to go to interfaces, configure EXT. And of course, once you've done that, you then have the ability to configure all of the different inputs and ports for that EXT as well. I'm not going to go through this too much in detail now, but as you can see on screen, I'm just basically selecting the first input. I'm going to make that digital input, and then I'm going to set a range of 0 to 9 volts. But underneath that, you can see you have the ability to check the inputs at startup. This is sometimes a really useful feature if you want to check the inputs when the controller boots up. And then finally, you also have the ability to set the serial port to a different baud rate if you need to, and extra parameters that will allow you to configure the EXT. So finally, once you're done with all that and you're happy the project file is good to go, upload it, give it a test, obviously make sure it works. If you do get stuck, you can always email us and we can kind of walk you through. But hopefully that project walkthrough today will show you some really cool quick tips that's going to allow you to improve your workflow and just speed up and make your programming a little bit more efficient. And I think on that note, Baz, I'll hand back to you.
Yeah, great, Ryan.
That's fine.
I think this was extremely useful. I see most people have been able to join all the time. There's, of course, just a lot to tell because it's an extreme versatile project. There's been one question that came in, so I'd like to ask you, can you go back to designer window? Because the question was, well, not really related to the TPC, but more in general, but I think we can take the time now to answer it. Of course, for the other participants, in case you need to leave, feel free to leave. We understand it's been a bit a long session.
Yeah. Give me a second, Baz, I'm just literally loading up designer now.
No problem.
Okay, there we go. So yeah, I've got designer open. Go.
Yeah. Okay. If you go to the trigger page.
Yeah.
The question was, when you add multiple actions to a single trigger.
Yes.
The question was if you can put delay between it. And what I already typed, but I think it's good to show. Maybe if you can make a new soft trigger.
Yep, certainly.
And
I think I know where you're going with this.
Yeah, and maybe first please add intensity to it, action master intensity.
Yeah.
Because in the master intensity, we have a default to say, had to make it happen a bit later. The delay is default action. But for all the other triggers, let's say you want to start timeline 1 and 5 seconds later, timeline 2, we have something called an IO module. And in this case, it will be the wait IO module. That's like a plugin to the system. And I guess Ryan might already have it. In case you don't, there's the download button in your screen available to type or to find wait. Maybe type in wait on the search.
There you go.
So click it, and this will download it to your machine. It will appear on the list on the left. If you now click new, all of a sudden there will be new actions you can choose.
So now we can go down to the wait here.
Exactly. So we can say wait 5 seconds, and then, well, maybe we're going to make a new soft trigger, which will be 22. That will start at second timeline. So let's say
that one, yeah.
It's just an example. And before this, maybe in trigger 21, we can add start timeline, whatever, just before this trigger.
Yeah, let's just make that one. Yeah.
Yeah. So what will now happen if, well, trigger number 21 is fired, and of course this right now it's a soft trigger, but this can come from anything, from a button panel or whatever is required. This will start the first timeline downloads to 100%, then we'll wait 5 seconds, fire trigger number 22. There's also other ways with flags on timelines. I mean, multiple ways to achieve what you were looking for, Marius. So I hope this, having seen it on the screen, helps. If there's no other questions left, I think we are going to ramp up. Or round down, I mean. So let me take over the screen from you, Ryan.
Yep, sure.
And be sure that is showing this one. Here we go. Yeah, okay, that seems to look good. So thank you, Ryan, for this presentation. And thank you for the questions, Marius. If any questions come up after this meeting, you can always contact us at support@faroscontrols.com. After this webinar, you might receive a mail with a survey where you can provide feedback and suggest other topics for the webinar, which will be much appreciated. With this, I'll be ending the webinar. I'd like to thank you for your attendance, and I hope to see you next time.